So I said earlier that I want to talk about a historic figure, somebody that actually provides inspiration to me in times of uncertainty. And this goes quite a far ways back. This person is Hamilton's boss. Every indispensable man and woman deserves a musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda. As you may recall, people had forgotten who Alexander Hamilton was. In fact, they were about to take him off the face of the $10 bill until that play came out. But the truly indispensable man is Hamilton's boss. Hamilton worked for him for 5.5 years. And as we learned when we visited Mount Vernon 5 years ago and met with the historians there on George Washington, he has tremendous lessons to teach us about dealing with uncertainty. So let's dispel a couple of myths first. He did not chop down the cherry tree. That never happened. He did not have wooden teeth. I don't know where that came from. Kind of gross. And he never wore a wig. He did powder his hair, but he never wore a wig. Here's his childhood reality. This is the truth. He was raised in a family that raised tobacco. His father had slaves. When he was 11 years old, his dad died. Not a great thing for a kid back then in the colonial era. And his uncles did not step up. They did not encourage him. They did not provide him a formal education. So he took his first job at 15 years old. And he taught himself. He was a relentless leader, and he expected the same from all the people that worked for him. And he believed in something pretty deeply. He believed that you can control how prepared one is for success, but not whether you have success or not. It's the preparation that you can control. So let's talk about these lessons. The first is in perseverance. Most people have forgotten that he served for 8 years. He was commissioned to lead the Continental Army in 1775. This is well before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. People often get this in the wrong order. He'd been fighting for a year before the Declaration of Independence, or preparing for war. And this went all the way through 1783 when he resigned his commission a year after the Battle of Yorktown. As you see on the top, the blues are his wins, the reds are his losses, or the British wins, and the whites are the neutrals, the draws, and the gold stars indicate what were considered to be the most important battles. He won 35% of the time. He drew 24% of the time, and he lost more. He lost 41% of the time. In fact, you see that period in 1776 after the Declaration of Independence where he lost a lot, but he persevered for this. The entire time he persevered. Second important lesson is people first. He cared deeply about his troops and the morale of his troops. Over that 8-year period, there were 7 winters. He stayed every winter with his troops. That was unprecedented at the time. Generals at that time did not stay in the field in the winter. They went back to the major cities. They were with their friends. They ate, they drank, they partied, they celebrated, waiting for the spring thaw to come back out. He stayed with them. And the little unsung hero in this is Martha Washington, because she actually came out and visited him regularly to keep his morale up, to make sure he was doing okay. So very much she was a partner to him through this difficult period. And he was a different decision maker too. In the Second Battle of Trenton, he pulled together his war council and asked for their advice. He pulled some locals in, asked for their advice. Cornwallis was coming towards him. And they said, Washington, we need to get out of here now. We are at risk of being outflanked and destroyed. And so on a very cold night, they got up and they left for Princeton, and probably saved the army by doing so. So why is this so different? Because back then, generals did not seek the counsel of locals. They didn't seek the counsel of the people subordinated to them. They were supposed to be all-knowing. Washington didn't view it that way. He wanted the ideas and opinions of all of his people. And he carried this forth into his cabinet. At that time, he only had 4 members of the cabinet. It was established by Washington. He had Jefferson at State, Hamilton in Treasury, Knox at War, and Randolph as the Attorney General. And his expectation of these 4 men was to make sure he understood both sides of every issue. Not one side, not their favorite side. He wanted to see both sides and wanted to see that very clearly. And the tension between Jefferson and Hamilton was actually quite powerful and served him extremely well in his decision making. Next, he was an innovator. Now, most of his innovations were on the farm. He was an incredibly entrepreneurial farmer at Mount Vernon. But he did do some innovations during the time of war. And one of these is that you can see this little knife. And they used this for taking the scabs of smallpox off a person with it and then putting into small cuts on soldiers who didn't have it. And it was his way of inoculating his troops. He made a decision, and it was a calculated risk, to inoculate all of his troops at the exact same time. And this put him out of commission for a couple of weeks. If Cornwallis had known this, he would have came in and destroyed them. But he felt it was better to control whether they got smallpox or not on his schedule than have it hit him at a very bad time. And then very importantly, he was a man of purpose. This is a famous quote. King George III asked American-born painter Benjamin West what Washington was going to do now that he had won the war. And West said, well, they say he will return to his farm. And the king replied, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And then Washington would repeat this again. After serving as president twice, he would return to his farm. So twice, Washington gave up tremendous power, unmatched power in the United States, because he believed in the republic and he believed that was going to advance mankind. That was much more important to him. And last lesson, he was a slave owner. We talked about this. Slavery had been in the colonies for hundreds of years. He did come to oppose slavery for two reasons. One, as he got to know more about abolitionists in the North, as he was fighting the Revolutionary War, he heard them, and they said this is immoral. Human beings should not be treated this way, and he came to agree with them on this. And the second was more practical. As a person who ran an advanced farm, was considered a modern farmer, he saw slavery did not have a future. It was not economic to have slaves on your property doing this work. It needed to be automated, it needed to be mechanized, there had to be other approaches. So it's both a moral reason and an economic reason he didn't support slavery. But he knew he could not unify the colonies into a republic, which was his purpose. Keep in mind, that was his purpose, the most important thing he was doing, if he outlawed slavery. Because Virginia, the largest state, would not join New York if there was a demand of outlawing slavery. So instead, using foresight, he planted a few seeds. The first seed, and this is my personal opinion, is there's no way all men are created equal would have been in the Declaration of Independence without him. It took his approval, for one, and I am sure it took his pressure. I'm sure there are many people that want to say all white men are created equal, and he made sure that that was not introduced. And then he did something very important people seem to have forgotten. There would be no Declaration of Independence of any meaning if he hadn't won. He spent 8 years of his life under tremendous hardship with no compensation to win so that declaration would stand. And then on his passing, in his will, he freed his slaves and gave each of those slaves money to start their own lives. And his expectation was that was going to set a powerful precedent, particularly with folks like Jefferson, who would follow him as president, and Madison, who were human rights advocates. So he let that domino fall, and that domino struck no other domino. And that would probably be one of his greatest regrets if he knew that's what really happened. So in summary, he gave up his ego, his power, financial gain to deliver on his purpose, this idea of the untried republic. He persevered for 8 years under great uncertainty and very poor conditions. He maintained a people-first approach throughout. He took calculated risk, and he made sure there was no single fatal blow, whether it be through smallpox or a single battle where Cornwallis could have taken him out. And that often meant retreating and putting his ego aside to make sure he protected his troops. As we said earlier, he was a lifelong learner, and he did try to make a difference in the lives of those with subordinated rights. For me, he sounds like you. In the crucible of this chaos, the 1-2 punch we've experienced so far, you didn't lose yourself. And you were and continue to be a helper. You're striving to be people first, you're protecting your purpose, and you're persevering. And this will go on. This is not over. More punches are coming, as we talked about earlier. But like Washington, you will persevere, and you're going to make a difference. And for that, I'm grateful.